At the National Memorial Arboretum, the tune being played is "The Battle's Over." It is 75 years since victory in Japan and East Asia ended the brutal Second World War, a period where over 50 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, victory was declared in Europe, but in East Asia, the battle continued for a further 3 months. Now, 3/4 of a century later, veterans gathered to remember their fallen friends. The 14th Army were the main Commonwealth fighting force against Japan. Their units came from across the world, from Africa to India. Today, we remember how a multiracial and multicultural force gave their lives.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
This is one among many commemorations here and across Asia, like in Hong Kong, in India, and in Japan. The ritual of remembrance differs here, but the commitment to never return is shared.
Our
country has consistently valued peace and moved forward. We have made the utmost effort to make the world a better place, never to repeat the tragedy of war. We will continue to remain committed to this resolute pledge.
And for all the veterans still alive, today is another moment to honor those who died. The battle is over. The fight to never forget continues.
Well, earlier I spoke to the World War II historian James Holland, and I began by asking him about the significance of VJ Day.
VJ Day is much more important than VE Day. And it's very interesting, if you look back to kind of 75 years ago, the rhetoric of particularly people like Churchill and President Truman, who'd just taken over from Roosevelt, on VE Day back in May, was very much sort of weary resignation. Yes, it's great that we've got this bit done, but we've still got a massive task ahead of us in the Far East.
Victory over Hitler in Europe in May, the war in Asia plows on for another few months. It was often called the Forgotten War or the Forgotten Armies. I mean, if you're one of those POWs who was caught up, building the Burmese railway, or, suffering or dying, in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, how bitter are you about the fact that the limelight has gone off your war?
It was a time where all kind of sort of moral compasses had just completely gone. The Japanese did treat people really inhumanely. And I suppose that geographically is a long way away. And so it doesn't have that kind of sort of immediate threat that V2s coming over towards Britain had in kind of late 1944, for example, or first part of 1945. And I guess that's why they're kind of largely forgotten. But if you're a survivor from all that and you've seen those terrible scenes, you've seen your fellows starve to death or died because of malnutrition or beatings or torture or used as bayonet practice by the Japanese, then you're going to feel pretty bitter about it.
And do you think that Asia views VJ Day in the same way that we view it? I mean, do they see it as, liberation from, the tyranny of Japan, or is it a slightly more complex picture because of the rise of China?
Yeah, I think it's a whole load more complex. And, very, very quickly, Japan became our friend and our ally and is one of our closest allies now. And long may that continue. And it's also complex because so many of the lands over which British troops particularly were fighting and Indian troops were fighting were part of the British Empire. And that's a dirty word now. And, we have a very, very different relationship with our imperial past than we did back in 1945. So there's all sorts of complexities involved in the whole thing.
One more, James. I mean, this is maybe the last time that we've had actual survivors of VJ Day still alive telling us their stories. We can't that won't go on for years. I mean, what will it be like when they're not there anymore?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I think it'll be quite traumatic, as it was when Harry Patch died, the last of the First World War survivors. There was a sort of great sort of intake of breath, and we all suddenly realized that, that had gone out of living history into a kind of deeper past. But I suspect that there won't be any lessening of interest. It's still pretty recent.
James Holland, thank you very much indeed. Well, as we just mentioned, a small number of veterans of that grueling war in the Pacific are still alive. Among them, those who were part of the Chindits, a special unit made up of troops from the UK, Burma, Hong Kong, India, Nepal, West Africa, and the US. They operated deep behind enemy lines in Myanmar's humid jungles. Conditions were appalling, as was the casualty rate. Our reporter Jane Dodge has been speaking to one of their fast dwindling number. His memories remain vivid 7.5 decades on.
The regimental blazer is out. The medals have been polished. But at 101, Jim Posnett is staying at home in Melton Mowbray today. He says his marching days are over.
How's that?
In 1940, Jim joined the 7th Battalion Leicestershire Regiment and found himself on a glider heading into the Burmese jungle.
I was very frightened, the same as all the other fellas. We were all in the same boat, so the glider was full of frightened men.
Named after the lion-like figures guarding Burmese temples, the Chindits in this case consisted of a specially trained force of British, Gurkhas and Burmese. Their leader describes them as a long-range penetration group.
Jim was a Chindit, fighting behind Japanese lines for months on end. His ultimate fear, not death, but capture.
I was frightened, and real frightened, of being took prisoner. That's the thing I was frightened of. Because we'd heard stories about what the Japanese were like in the prison camps and how they treated people. And they were real cruel people to chaps in the prison camps. And the other thing was, I don't think I would have been in a camp long, I should have been on the railway. And they called it the Death Railway, which was quite true, because they did say, for what it was worth, for every sleeper that was laid on that railway, a man died.
From Moulmein in Burma to Bangkok in Siam, they built the Railway of Death. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese, Malays, Burmese and Indians, and 25,000 Allied prisoners of war.
That proved to be a gross underestimate. More than 60,000 Allied prisoners of war were forced to work on the Burma Railway. 12,000 of them died.
All this happened a long way away from us here at home, but it did happen. Let no one forget it.
Do you feel forgotten sometimes?
Yes. The 7th Battalion Leicestershire Regiment was a battalion of good men. Every one of them.
How many did you lose?
Nearly half a battalion.
How many was that?
A lot of men.
Jim still has nightmares about his time in the jungle, but a chance encounter outside Westminster Abbey a few years ago has helped put some memories to rest.
We were on the way out, on the path out, and these two young Japanese ladies, I think they'd be about 18, stopped us. I said, and excused us, can we have a word with us? We said, yes, why, what's the matter? He said, we would like to apologise to you for what our men did to your men in the war. You see, well, we just stood there for a moment, couldn't speak, you know, the three of us. And I'm sure we all did shed a tear.
7 decades on, Sergeant Posnett, now known as Gentleman Jim in his local pub, is philosophical about his time in the jungle. At the end of the day, he says, at least it taught him how to look after himself.